Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hello, and welcome to episode 82 of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another story. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First, check out the website if you haven't at TheKillFile.com, where you can find the merch shop. We have some funny true crime items along with some catchy true crime gear. While you are there, you can suggest a case for me to cover or even fill out the form for the listener files. The listener files is just one category of the bonus content that we now offer over on Patreon or on Spotify called The Hidden Files. The listener files will be some of your own true crime stories that you are willing to share with the rest of us, compiled into episodes. They can be light or dark, short or long. Just send them into thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com or fill out that form on the website. The Hidden Files are just $3 a month, and you will receive 2 bonus episodes on subjects that are slightly different than our regular Monday episodes. These will be things like assassinations, plane crashes, natural disasters, and the like. If you like The Kill File and you want more content, I would say sign up. Also, if you have a hard time listening to some of the darker and heavier true crime cases that we cover, you may like The Hidden Files. It's cheap, it's fun, and it helps to further the podcast, where one day I hope to add even more content for you all each week. Lastly, please just take a second to rate, review, subscribe, and or follow whichever you do on your listening app to get the newest episodes every Monday. And also, this is the best way to support the podcast and help others find it so we can continue to grow. If you have already done this, thank you so very much. You guys have no idea what your continued support and encouragement has done for me and the podcast. I am truly grateful for each and every one of you who keep coming back for more. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to be talking about someone very interesting named Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder, talks of cannibalism, talks of rape, talks of pedophilia, and talks of domestic abuse. Let's jump in. Today's story is going to take us all the way to Brazil, more specifically to a farm in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, where our serial killer of the day was born in 1954. Santa Rita do Sapucaí is a municipality of Brazil that, according to an AI overview, is known for its electronics companies and even startups in the area, as well as telecommunications. There is a school there called Inatel, which is the National Institute of Telecommunications, and another school there called ETE, which is the Francisco Moreira de Costa Technical School. This area is also known for its dairy farming and also coffee farms, or fazendas. Another thing that I found interesting about this area and loved very much was that it was considered a pioneer on its stances on various issues. For example, the early adoption of gay marriage. Good for them. There was said to be famous street parties in this part of Brazil, like carnivals and festivals, and there is said to be the most beautiful scenery as well. Now, back in the 50s, when our killer was born in the area, something that I thought was so interesting was the spark of how this area would later be known as Electronics Valley. It stemmed back from a woman ahead of her time having attended a lecture by Einstein himself. Lucia Reno Moreira had listened to Einstein's lecture about how technology was going to be humanity's future, and to say he was right is a giant understatement. Lucia took this to heart and started down her own path, eventually helping in the creation of a technical school where her vision was to help younger people. In fact, she would donate the land that the school Inatel would be built on, with their government having financed the project. This brings us to the birth of Mr. Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Was born on some sources say June 17th, others October 29th, but the year are both the same, 1954. Pedro's story seemed to have begun before he even left the womb, as his abusive father would kick his pregnant mother in the stomach. In fact, this would result in Pedro having a brain injury and damaged skull at birth. It was said that his grandmother was in the room as Pedro was being born and was the one who noticed the damage. We all know the correlation between head injuries and aggression or compulsive issues. Pedro's family lived on a farm where they didn't have much money as they struggled to raise their 8 children. It was known that Pedro's father was an abusive man towards his family, his wife, and later on others. Pedro is said to have never attended school. Instead, he was forced to work to help his family, and only his abusive father and extremely strict mother were role models in his life. not the best examples of how to be a functioning adult. Pedro's family was said to be very faithful or religious, which can come with its own set of issues depending on how extreme that would have been. Pedro's behavior as a youth, according to sources, would be unlike the other children. Not just reserved or withdrawn, as someone from an abusive household might be, but as we all know, what we learn or see as children can sometimes manifest as we are growing up or even into our adulthood. Pedro would start to show signs of aggression, physical anger, and didn't seem to have the same empathy that others might display. Pedro would later on describe his first urge to kill as coming when he was around 13 years old, when his cousin and himself had gotten into a fight over a borrowed horse, and Pedro said that he had pushed his cousin into the sugarcane press. Thankfully, the cousin would live, but this was really the first cross over that line of homicidal tendencies. Something that is pointed out in many sources when it comes to the life of Pedro Rodrigues Filho is something that his father had done: murder. I guess Pedro's father worked at a school as a security guard, and he was caught stealing something from the school. Now, instead of quitting, being fired, or facing charges for the theft, Pedro's father was said to have murdered the person who had actually caught him. Why this was considered a better choice, I have no idea. I can only imagine, and this is my conjecture, that his father panicked and didn't really think it through, and murdered the person said to be like an administrator or something. After this, Pedro's father was on the lam, which left the family in dire straits. Of course, add this to the rumors and stigma of being a murderer's son, and Pedro was having a rough time. It is believed that his family life, coupled with his brain injury and topped with the fact that his father murdered someone and didn't face consequences, are the exact mixture of issues that would bring Pedro to committing his first murder at age 14. Pedro at the time was fueled with what was believed to be anger and revenge against something this man did against his father. Pedro hunted him down, allegedly the vice mayor of a town, and killed him. It is believed that Pedro was not acting off of impulse or instant circumstances, but rather had plotted and planned to kill his first victim. After he committed the act of murder, he would flee the area, and he would set out on what would become his motive for murder. See, the one thing that I forgot to mention that I will now is that Pedro had a few nicknames in his day, and one included the Brazilian Dexter. His motive? Vigilante justice. It was weird when I was looking into this case. I actually had no idea that his other nickname had to do with Dexter, and as I was learning, I kept thinking to myself, I've heard another case where Dexter is pointed to as a similarity, but that case was more about how he set up a kill room, and this one has to do with the fact that the man ends up murdering bad people. For anyone who hasn't watched the show Dexter, first off, you're missing out. It is an incredible show, one of my absolute personal favorites, and the new reboot is phenomenal. Come on, there's only a handful of shows that have been rebooted that many times and still holds up. So Dexter, for anyone who doesn't know, is a fictional character on a show where he himself is a serial killer, and he has the urge to kill other people. However, with his adopted father being a cop and seeing this in him, he taught his son a strict code to set him on a path of taking out bad people instead of innocent victims. It seems as if the character of Dexter Morgan is based on the combination of a few people, but Pedro Rodrigues Filho is one of the biggest portions of the character and where it came from, which is nuts to me that I happen to be a huge freaking fan of Dexter and stumbled upon the serial killer. Without knowing, I was kind of putting the pieces together myself before I realized, holy shit, he is the guy that it's modeled after. Now, of course, in the show, not every single one ended up fitting the code, but when he hunted, they sure did. He would refrain when he needed to if they didn't fit the code, and it seems that Pedro also seemingly had his own code when it came to people that he murdered. But just as in the show, I'm not sure that every person is going to fit into the code, at least at first, as the first murder he committed didn't seem to when he was 14 years old. This one was circled around rumors of something to do with his father, but it was unclear to me exactly what had happened. Later on, when Pedro would speak about the crimes, which he was able to do freely, in fact, he's all over YouTube if you're curious, he would describe his quote-unquote code, which was basically his own rules on who he was going to kill. They needed to fit into particular areas before Pedro would decide to take them out. For example, Pedro would say that the only people that he would target were people he felt deserved to die. This would include murderers, rapists, and even drug dealers. People who he felt were hurting society or communities, and he would be the one that would bring them to justice. After committing his first murder, Pedro fled and would end up in Mogi das Cruzes, which is part of the greater São Paulo, where I guess his godparents lived. This is where Pedro would meet a woman named Botina, which is actually her nickname. Her full name was Maria Aparecida Olimpia. Maria was, according to sources, a drug lord's widow, and for whatever reason, Pedro would start living with Maria. Now, at the time, Pedro was just 14 years old, and it was reported that Maria was a full-grown woman, so yuck. I guess Pedro was the person who stepped into the role of like the drug pusher and the actions that would come with his new position, i.e. taking out some of the competition. And that's what Pedro did. He would take out some opposing gang members and also some that were said to be acquaintances. Pedro would say that Maria was the love of his life and was rumored to have had her name tattooed on his arm. But while Pedro may claim this was love, others may claim it was anything but. Maria was seemingly someone who would use people to her advantage, even if it came down to sleeping with a 14-year-old Pedro to get what she wanted from him. And while this could be easy for a woman rumored to be in her late 20s or 30s, I think that we could see why a young boy of Pedro's age and background could believe that she was the one for him. It actually kind of saddens me to think this 14-year-old young boy who grew up the way that he did and already had committed a murder and ran away from home was taken in by this lady, and all the while he is probably so happy to be loved and cared for and is infatuated with Maria for being one of the only people who was probably nice to him and showed him attention or affection. Either way, I guess Maria and Pedro were at some point engaged. Now, at the time that Pedro started to take out gang-affiliated members, drug dealers, and the like, there was someone who believed that Pedro, taking the stance of judge, jury, and executioner all on his own, is unacceptable and not his place. On the other hand, there were people who believed that Pedro was doing society or even their community and streets a favor by taking out criminals and sparing the citizens. And for this, people started calling him Vigilante Pedrino Matador, which is another way of saying like Lil Petey Killer. During that time that Pedro was quote-unquote climbing the ranks of whatever gang or operation that Maria was now running, it was rumored that there was some jealousy among the other boys who had been a part of the organization for a longer period of time, but who were not quite making the headway that Pedro was. It seems he came in with a splash. So, one source would describe an incident where Pedro was offered by some of the other boys to smoke some weed on one occasion, and although Pedro went with the boys, he was sort of paranoid the entire time that they were going to take him out, maybe because of the jealousy. They were all armed, and there would come a point where Pedro reached his limit. He drew his weapon, demanding that the other boys put theirs down, and they did. For whatever reason, this is when Pedro would shoot the other boys, firing squad style. 2 of them would die, and the 3rd would be taken to the hospital. What confused me is that these are people who were employed by Maria, part of his own gang or whatever, so why would he kill his own accomplices? I mean, he either knew that they were plotting against him, or his whole vigilante facade was bullshit and convenient, right? This is how things went for a bit, and there would come a day where Pedro was said to be between 16 and 17 years old, and Maria would end up pregnant. The 2 would become engaged, but sources would say that Maria would never end up having the baby, sadly suffering a miscarriage. Pedro, upon coming home one day, would find Maria shot to death, and one source would say there was even a message written on the wall in Maria's blood, quote, "We will get you." Pedro was absolutely heartbroken, obviously, and filled with rage, wanting to seek out whoever did this to his poor Maria. And remember, he is still hovering under the age of 18, so this teenage boy is now planning to hunt out what is assumed to be a rival gang member to take out because they killed the love of his life. As Pedro set out on his mission, he would end up capturing and torturing several people, trying to figure out exactly which rival was responsible for the death of his beloved Maria. It was said that the only reason he would end up finding out who it was exactly was because of an ex-wife who came to Pedro of the man responsible. When Pedro and 4 of his accomplices would find the man, he was attending a wedding, and here, 7 people were killed and as many as 16 others were injured. All I could think of was Kill Bill or The Red Wedding. I can't imagine the carnage. But also, were their innocents killed, or were they all gang members? Because this case is from Brazil, sometimes other countries' stories and cases can be hard to find details, and sometimes even just the basic information. But the other countries' killers are my favorite to cover, so I just do my best, but there's always some leftover questions. After this would come what some people would call a rampage of acts that Pedro seemingly deemed for the right reasons. It was said Pedro was known to burn down buildings that were said to be businesses known to have laundered drug money for local criminal organizations, robbed what were said to be food trucks and distributed food to the poor, and was also known to have hurt or killed people who had hurt women in the past. One such incident would come in the form of Pedro's cousin, a woman who had gotten pregnant by her boyfriend, but the boyfriend had refused to marry her. Pedro took it upon himself to kill said boyfriend. This is what I'm talking about. It's one thing to just, like in the show Dexter, to kill murderers or rapists or whatever, but for whatever reason, in real life, as it is seemingly on TV, these acts spill over to people that may not, quote-unquote, deserve it. May 24th, 1973, Pedro is arrested and placed in the back of a police officer's car. Of course, to be hauled in, Pedro at this time was just 19. Well, Pedro was not alone in the back of the police vehicle. There was another man back there with him. Another man who happened to be a rapist. By the time the authorities arrived with both of their suspects in the back of the car, Pedro had killed the rapist without anyone ever knowing what was happening. I wonder what happened there with him killing a man in police custody. Like, did the officers also get in trouble for not doing what they needed to do to secure them both? Pedro is then charged with what sources would say is 18 counts of murder, to which he claims that the number was much higher. While Pedro is in prison, not only does he finally learn how to read and write, but he also kind of putters out of the gang that he was in initially because he couldn't really contact them that much. This is around the same time that Pedro gains some infamy as a killer, and if anyone thought that his killing rampages would stop while he was in prison, they would be wrong. They have essentially put him smack dab in the middle of the lion's den of criminals, including murderers and rapists, the kinds of people that Pedro seeks out. It was estimated that Pedro would go on to murder 48 people while serving his sentence of 128 years. One man that Pedro would end up killing was a man that had been accused of his sister's murder. About this man, Pedro would say, quote, "He was my friend, but I had to kill him." This man, Pedro, would behead in prison with what was said to be called a blunt knife. Another person Pedro killed of note was his own father. Yeah, so it turns out that Pedro's father had killed Pedro's mother by stabbing her, sadly, 21 times. Heartbreaking. And also, what the hell is up with this family? Like, why is there so much murder? I guess eventually Pedro and his father would be serving time in the same place, and this is when he would decide to take out his father for what he did to his mother. I guess Pedro's father had suspected that his mother could be cheating on him, and this was the reason for her murder, which is absolutely nuts. I know cheating is awful, and it hurts, for sure, but murder? What the fuck? Anyways, as father and son were in the same facility, Pedro was able to get to his father and stabbed him 22 times, saying that since his mother was stabbed 21, Pedro was going to stab his father 22. Then, according to Pedro, and this comes up a lot in the research into this case, Pedro cut and or ripped out his father's heart and bit a piece of it. While in prison, not only did Pedro kill people he deemed deserved it, but he would also sport a tattoo that said, "Matu por prazer," or "I kill for pleasure." It was stated in sources that most inmates hated Pedro, which I can imagine if he is killing them on the inside and maybe had this moral compass, no matter how skewed. There were times that people tried to hurt him while he was inside prison. One such incident, Pedro was informed that people had been planning to ambush him. Pedro was smart and had already figured out how easy it would be to buy a knife off of a guard, and this is what he would use to protect himself. As the inmates were in the yard, a fellow inmate made his move at Pedro, quickly followed by 4 accomplices. Within just minutes, the brawl had shifted. 3 attackers of Pedro's were dead, and he was not done fighting yet. However, the last 2, they were done. They fucking took off in fear. There was said to be a crowd around watching the fighting and murdering go on inside the prison. As Pedro spent more time in prison, observers would say that it seemed as though he was starting to pull out his knife for more flippant reasons. Maybe not necessarily the ones that he had began with when he was saving his vigilante justice for the people that he felt were the worst of the worst. Each time that Pedro would be transferred to different facilities, he would continue to murder fellow inmates. Sources say that Pedro would end up at 9 different institutions, where he would eventually end up at a place called Tabate, which was said to be for people who can't really adapt to any of the prisons or facilities that they were placed. This would be a center adjoined to a different institution where Pedro would end up being isolated for a decade. Can you imagine being alone, basically, except for being like around guards or whatever, for 10 fucking years? I would go insane with boredom. Oh God, that would suck so bad. I guess Pedro found ways to fill his time doing gymnastics and playing a lot of solitaire. Eventually, he would be put back into regular prison where Pedro would self-describe as more calm now than he used to be, and alleged his only enemy now would be another killer named the Maniac of the Park, which we will probably cover at some point. He's a serial killer who hurt women. Pedro was said to have also had the job of being in charge of cleaning the prison's school. When the time came where the park maniac and Pedro came face to face, Pedro warned the man that he was going to kill him, and according to one source, the maniac spit in Pedro's face. The guards then warned the maniac that what he just did was stupid and told him who Pedro was. Long story short, there was said to be a rebellion where Pedro was going to get the chance inside the prison to kill the maniac. However, someone up high had come to Pedro and said that if he did that, it would take away from his rebellion, etc., so Pedro could not murder the maniac. Instead, when the rebellion started, the maniac went and hid in a cell farther away, and when Pedro and his accomplices found him but knew they couldn't kill him, they raped the maniac using objects. Keep in mind, the maniac was known for raping and killing women in a park, so take that as you will as far as vigilante justice goes. While Pedro was in prison, he would be evaluated by different psychologists, two of which were named Antonio José Andrés and Norberto Zoner Jr., who both gave the opinion that not only was an antisocial personality disorder diagnosis fitting for Pedro, but they also felt that his motivation for murdering people was some sort of self-affirmation violence. Seemingly, Pedro felt that what he had done and the people that he had killed were bad, so they deserved it, and he was doing society a favor. He also admitted that he enjoyed inflicting pain on others. According to an article written by the Apoca Print and an interviewer who sat down with Pedro asking him numerous questions about his family and his situation in prison, during that interview, the question came up as to whether Pedro had any regrets for the things that he had done, and the answer to this was, quote, "I don't have any. I only killed people who were worthless," end quote. When the interviewer brought up the fact that people on the outside were afraid of him, Pedro would talk about how he felt that people were afraid of him because he himself never really bothered to find out why he kills people. He then talked about how he has never killed a woman or a family man, and especially not children. He further commented saying that when children come in for visits, he often plays with them and gives them advice, feeling like their own parents don't have time for them really. He then stated how he actually loved kids. Pedro then spoke to the evolution of the prison system, and when asked if it was true that oftentimes people come out worse than they were before, he would state, quote, "Prison doesn't rehabilitate anyone, my friend. The guy comes out resentful. He learns things he didn't know," end quote. I personally feel that there is some truth to this for sure. Maybe not for everyone, because sometimes I think that people are set straight or are afraid to ever have to go back, but I definitely believe that there are people in prison who prison does absolutely nothing for, and they may even thrive on the inside and are at least the same when they get out. So, due to Brazil's system at the time, Pedro would be considered for parole after having served 30 years. This would be in 2003. However, due to the extra murders that he had committed after being put in prison, his sentence was no longer 128 years. Now it was up to 400 years. Nevertheless, his initial parole year was approaching, and after his public defender had put this into question in front of a judge, it was denied, stating that the crimes that occurred after the defendant is in prison makes the calculation of serving 30 years different. Therefore, Pedro was then released on April 24th, 2007, after 34 years in prison. After Pedro was released, not only had he vowed to continue to kill bad people, but he would actually end up being arrested yet again in 2011 on September 15th for charges having to do with rioting and deprivation of liberty. I'm guessing these were from when he was inside prison because I did see something about him possibly taking a guard's gun at the time that he killed his father and maybe holding him there while he finished murdering his father. But then it was said that he handed the gun back to him and he never harmed anyone else. He just wanted his father dead. The charges could be from that or they could be from other crimes, of course. Pedro would serve an additional 7 years for those crimes and then, once again, be let out on December 10th, 2018. After getting out the second time, he claimed to have found Christianity and had been reborn. He was known to have worked as a night watchman, and also he started his own YouTube channel. Yeah, this guy is all over YouTube, and his channel is called Pedrino, Former Killer with Jesus. His audience, I believe one source said, had like over 28,000 followers or fans, and millions of people have watched his videos. You can see him talk about different subjects and openly talking about his own past and violence. One source said on a different app he had over 250,000 followers, where I guess he speaks about different crimes, about different criminals, and warns the younger generation about a life of crime. I saw one where him and another fellow were talking about some serial killer maybe out there in Brazil, and their thoughts on some book that he always carried with him, and the fact that this guy killed women and children too. Having it translated isn't always perfection, so it was a little hard to understand some of it, but I really just wanted to see like his demeanor and his reaction to things. He did mention that him and his co-host man were both no longer on that path. I'm guessing that he means like the murdering path or criminal. One source would say that there would be a line from a video that he made stating, quote, "There is no glory in crime, only destruction," end quote. On March 5th, 2023, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was murdered outside of one of his family members' homes in a place called Mozi das Cruzes. Sources say 2 men wearing hoods shot him numerous times before ultimately cutting his throat with an alleged kitchen knife. When Pedro died, he was 68 years old. And that, my friends, is the story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, aka Killer Petey, aka Pedrino Matador. What a crazy story, right? I found it so fascinating because of the Dexter aspect and the fact that he killed horrific criminals. Like, where is that line? So, an interesting tidbit that I found during my research was that the over 100 criminals that Pedro claimed to have killed may not have been an accurate number. Yes, he killed dozens of people, but over 100 seems to be an exaggerated number. There are also some exaggerated stories that have come from this serial killer. For example, the story about his father. It is true that his father had killed his mother, but there have been people who looked into the story about how he killed his father and bit his heart or ate it or spit it out or whatever. I've seen anything from the fact that his father died from other prisoners to his father dying of an illness like pneumonia or tuberculosis. The stories and facts seem to vary in some of the aspects of the case, and they still can't seem to figure out exactly what the truth is. But at least one of his sisters put the father's story in their book, and it's also in Pedro's biography, so who knows? But there is some skepticism. Now, let's talk about that line between vigilante and serial killer psychopath. Can they coexist? They do on Dexter. Also, if you haven't watched Dexter, drop what you're doing and go watch it right now. It won't disappoint you, and you won't regret it. But do you believe that if someone takes out other murderers and rapists, that it's okay for that person to commit murder? Personally, I'm torn because if they are serial killers or like they murder children, then I'm all for taking them out. However it's done, they gotta go. If they are rapists, I almost feel the same, but you gotta know the situation and for sure that they're guilty. However, if they're pedophiles, take their asses out, period. There are definitely pedophiles out there who don't act on their desires, and to me, that shows that it is possible. I truly believe that some things happen to people either when they're young or they're born a certain way in which their brain may mix things up, and maybe they find themselves attracted to people under the age of 18, and as sick and disgusting as that is, if someone were to get help, or at the very least, never act on their urges, then I don't believe that person deserves death. With that said, if they've ever acted on their urges or raped anyone, especially a child, they gotta fucking go. Again, this is just my own opinion, but where's that line drawn between this person deserves to die for their murderous ways or whatever crimes, and this person deserves to live because it was situational or they were young or whatever? Do you feel that drug dealers deserve to die? I personally don't. I know it's awful what they do, but sometimes people are born into these types of situations and the drug business wouldn't stop just because a dealer is taken out. Drug makers, on the other hand, maybe, because without them, there wouldn't be product. However, that's really a fantasy because someone else would just make it. It's just hard not to blame them when some kid overdoses and dies, you know? Anyways, I would love to know your guys' thoughts on the subject over on social media or on your listening app. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this crazy case as much as I did, and remember, to be a good person, or someone like Pedro, could be after your ass. Come on back next Monday when we will discover another case here on the Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Alright guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help the podcast grow and other true crime lovers to find us. Also, check out the website, TheKillFile.com, where you can suggest a case, find our merch shop, and submit a listener file. Follow The Kill File on your favorite social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. Of course, you can always subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.